Hello there, and welcome to all our attendees joining us today for this latest IoT Central webinar. This is Clive Maxfield, and I'll be your host. In addition to being a practicing engineer, I also act as a technology consultant, author, speaker, and educator. I'd like to start our webinar by thanking Aeris for sponsoring today's event. Aeris is a leading supporter of the IoT Central community, and we are grateful to have them as sponsors. Today's webinar is entitled Top 3 Things to Look For in an IoT Connectivity Provider. Before we begin, I'd like to briefly review the format of today's proceedings. This event will be 1 hour long. We will have one presenter who I'll introduce in just a moment. There will be a 10 to 15 minute question and answer session following the main presentation. And this event is being recorded and will be available on iotcentral.io tomorrow. I'd also like to encourage our attendees to provide questions throughout the presentation. We will be reviewing and presenting these questions on your behalf during the Q&A portion of the event. Now, I'm very pleased to introduce today's speaker, Chien. Jason is Head of Technical Marketing for Connected Solutions at Aeris. In this role, Jason oversees product marketing for cellular connectivity products, applying over 14 years of IoT experience at companies with over 165 million devices deployed and under management, including cellular connected devices, consumer products, smart grid, and building controls. He has worked with end-to-end IoT deployments that include connectivity, networking, the cloud, software, and embedded hardware. Jason holds a Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering and Computer Science from the University of California at Berkeley. So, thank you for being with us today, Jason. We very much look forward to your presentation. Cellular connectivity is everywhere, leaving many with the impression that providers are more or less the same. When it comes to the IoT, however, the reality is far more complex, with coverage, feature functionality, expertise and responsiveness varying significantly from provider to provider. These differences only matter more as you scale. In today's IoT Central webinar, you will learn what actually distinguishes providers from one another. Jason will also identify the uncommon but critical capabilities that most impact solution performance, reliability, and cost at scale. He'll reveal the technology backbone that distinguishes the most capable providers from the rest, and he'll list the five most important questions to ask prospective providers as you shop. So Jason, with that, I'm going to turn things over to you. You can begin as soon as you're ready to rock and roll.
Thanks, Max, for that introduction, and I'm happy to be and very pleased to be on the show today. Before we get started, I wanted to ask a quick poll question of the audience, and that question being just to get a sense of who we have in the audience and also for myself to know a little bit of background about you. So the question I wanted to ask folks is, how many IoT devices do you have deployed? So we're going to head and put those questions up, and you should see the responses there in front of you. So I'm going to give folks a few seconds to go ahead and look through those answers, think through their deployment, and just go ahead and select the choice so we can get a sense. I'll give people a few more seconds to go ahead and put that on. And go ahead and put in that selection that you wanted, make sure it's the right one you like. And we'll go ahead and close the poll, and let's go ahead and look at some results and see what we have. All right, so it looks like we've got a good mix of folks. We have some folks that are just getting started and some folks that are have deployed some, so that's good. So it'll be good. So some folks that have some experience and some folks will hopefully learn something new as they look to scale and begin to build out. And so it's good. So let's go ahead and dive into our topic for today. We'll go ahead and close those poll results there. And here we go. So for most of us here, when we think about building a cellular IoT device that's connected, there's a couple things. There's a lot of challenges. Even getting started is a really big first step. So often, for those that have done it and for those that are looking to start it, what you're typically going to need to do is you're going to need to build the hardware. And then you'll often including a cellular modem. And sometimes you'll also have to deal with cellular certification for that modem and that solution. Then you're going to have to write the software. Then you may have to select a cellular provider. And then you're going to have to connect to the cloud. And then you're going to have to build a website and mobile app. And all of this before you even send a single byte of data. So this is all you need to do, kind of the first step. And for those that have built out this kind of solution, you may see that your final solution looks something like this, with devices on the bottom, with sensors, and then you have your connectivity layer and your cloud. And then basically on top of the cloud, you'll build your different applications and integrations to various backend systems, and also to different web front ends and other interfaces that you're going to show to your end customer. So again, all of this, even just to get started, even just to send one scrap or piece of information. Now, let's say that you are able to get started with that great first step and things go really well. And the next problem you may have is, how do you grow at scale? It's a problem that most people hope to be able to have, because that means your product is successful. It means it's going somewhere. So while it's a good problem to have, it's still a problem nonetheless. So when we think about scaling, some things that we come up is, issues with the connection start to increase and sometimes get harder to diagnose. Again, this is the nature of scaling, because the quantity and number of devices you have goes up, and some of those problems that you start to see that you maybe could took for granted or didn't have to deal with start to crop up more. Things like overages start to come into play as well too. So overages being like, when you sign up for a cellular plan, typically you have a certain amount of data or text or voice minutes that you're going to have. But any kind of challenge or issue that comes up with your deployment at scale can lead to overages where you overuse and start to consume more than the expected amount that you signed up for. And also, sometimes many people may have encountered this, is when you start with a project, any kind of technology project that you're building, often you'll start with one provider, they're great, you get started with them, they're working really well. But sometimes when you start to get bigger, you start to see the cracks of the problems, where it's not working. And sometimes you have to go to another provider because the first one can't meet all the needs that you have. And so then you're stuck with a situation where you're managing multiple vendors because maybe the first one couldn't do it, and you bring in the second one, but you need both because your system depends on both. So then you start to have this multi-vendor system. So these are some challenges of scaling that kind of some people see. And also, as we say, as your data starts to grow, it can be hard to tell what's normal and what's abnormal or unexpected behavior. Some people have said data is the new oil, and everyone's about information and get all the data you can. But I kind of extend the analogy a little bit. If data is the new oil, when it's not contained and focused and refined and put into a usable format, it's what they call an oil spill. It's everywhere. It's just spilled all over. It's polluting everything, and it makes everything a mess. So it really has to be channeled and identified in ways that you can act upon it and see what you're going to do with it, especially when you have problems, or what's a problem versus just what's maybe a little bit of a glitch that's going to resolve itself. So I'd like to take a little bit of time to talk about Aeris. Part of it is Aeris has been doing this in the IoT space for 27 years. We have about 15 million devices connected, with sending about 1 billion IoT messages a day. So we have some experience dealing with some customers at scale, and that's some of those stories I'd like to share with you about what we've learned and what we've seen to help you guys as you are deploying your IoT connected solutions at scale. And also some things that you can look for when you go to look for a provider, things that we just encountered and seen our customers struggle and deal with that can benefit you as well. Also, a little bit about myself, thanks to Max for that introduction, but a little further about myself. I've been working in IoT for about 10 years and have worked with even things from purchasing, connectivity, and also worked in the IoT space from the marketing to the product side, and even from the technical and customer support side, as well as also even architecting solution. So having seen some deployments at scale, I'll also be sharing some stories from my experience of things I've seen as deployments grow and things to look out for that hopefully you, again, can learn from and benefit from as well, too. So when we talk about IoT, connected solutions and what to look for in a provider and to think about scaling, I think of 3 foundational pieces. And those 3 pieces would be coverage, support, and cost control. So I'd like to go ahead and I'll talk more in depth about each of these, but first I want to start off with our first topic, which is coverage. Now, when we think about coverage, typically coverage at scale presents some challenges. When we're starting off small, and we have a smaller number of devices. And typically, we're only dealing with localized coverage. And we're only dealing with the carriers in that particular region because we've only deployed in a small geographic area. And again, cellular for IoT, as some may be familiar with on the call, is that unlike a smartphone, smartphone, you typically are going to get it and you're going to use it in your hand. And if any problems, you go to the store, get it fixed, or call the support line. IoT devices, not so much. Typically you don't take your smartphone, put it in a box, ship it somewhere else remotely far away, and then have to try to operate it remotely without having to see the screen and do it all remotely without having to go out there. That's kind of the scenario that a lot of IoT situations are in. And that's where some of the things that we're used to with smartphones don't quite translate to IoT space. And so we talk about connected devices for cellular, we have to make sure that we focus on a different use case and think about those challenges. And again, when we're starting off, typically localized coverage, we're typically only dealing with 2 to 4 mobile carriers because again, we're in a smaller geographic area. And typically we're often dealing with one cellular technology. And when I mean cellular technology, some people on the call may be familiar with the terms LTE-M or NB-IoT. Those are two purpose-built cellular technologies. And because of, again, our limited scope or defined area where we're deploying, typically we're only going to have one of those technologies that we're working with versus having to deal with multiple. So as we scale up, what typically happens is, one thing is we'll see is you're probably going to have to start to deal with international roaming. So it won't be sufficient anymore to deal with just the carrier or providers in your specific country or geography. You're probably going to need to deploy into other locations. Or if you're in other parts of the world, that'll be part of your business. But that's something we'll have to deal with. And also, as we go to scale, you're going to have to deal with more and more carriers. So from the 2 to 4 carriers, typically we may go through the 20 or 50 or more because just due to the complexity of the number of carriers. And again, when we talk about cellular technologies, we're dealing with 2 to 3. So because the one that we need may not be available in the location that we want, and we may have to use an alternative due to lack of support or coverage. And again, a quick note about carriers, this was a kind of thing that I had to learn is if you're specifically in North America or the US, typically we only have a few carriers, but if we're in other countries and locales, there's actually a much denser population of carriers. And in other locales and internationally, they'll have more carriers in the region and more to choose from. So more to manage and more to think through. So one thing I want to talk about is, the first thing I think about is roaming for cellular. When we think about a smartphone, we think about roaming. Roaming, typically, it's pretty easy. You take your phone, you have a plan or prepaid with your local provider. If you travel to another country or outside your zone, as long as you have bars, you can talk. Maybe you sign up for the extra international roaming package on your phone, or you have some other setup, and you're good, you're fine. It works for you. For connected devices for IoT, one of the challenges is that, this is again something I had to learn as I've been buying cellular connectivity, is that often there's actually more than one carrier to provide from, and often the carrier that the roaming partner or roaming agreement that your home carrier has in another country is not always chosen based on performance. Sometimes it's chosen based on cost or business reasons, which for a smartphone kind of makes sense because for a smartphone, high quality voice signal, high quality data, it's a premium device, it's going to get priority on the network. But for IoT devices, that becomes a little bit different. And shown here on the screen is an example that, for example, if you had a fleet tracking solution, you had trucks driving around and you're trying to monitor where those trucks go, in the country of Australia, they have 2 main carriers, which are Vodafone and Singtel. And so here shown on the map, for example, let's say you have an agreement, let's say you're based in one continent, but you have some solutions deployed in Australia, and you go ahead and your provider has an agreement with Vodafone. So they favor Vodafone towers due to business reasons or for areas cost factors. So they're going to select those towers. Even though the Singtel tower may be closer to where your device is, it may actually give you better performance. So again, this is something that, again, I've had to learn and kind of maybe new to some of you, is that when you choose a provider, you want to make sure that they're roaming partners, and when you get coverage in those other places, that you're accessing the best towers based on performance, again, not purely based on price or cost. So one of the customers I want to spend some time talking about is, Aeris has dealt with one of our customers who's an off-grid solar provider in Africa. Now, for those not familiar, in Africa, often the access to electricity and these kind of utilities are not as commonplace. So one solution that stepped in is off-grid solar, where A provider will give you a solar panel, and basically for a fee, you'll basically pay for the electricity generated by that solar panel. Now, the operator, in order to use that solar panel, needs to be able to monitor and control and basically have access to the power generated so they can see when the customer's paid or if they need to stop the power due to lack of payment and so on. So one of the customers we had was an off-grid solar provider, and what they were looking for was they needed to make sure that they had access to the network with the best coverage because they were having connectivity problems. They just couldn't reach their devices. And part of the challenge was when they couldn't reach them, they couldn't manage the payments, they couldn't see what was going on, see if there's any service issues. And so sometimes when they lost connectivity, they would often have to send people out there in trucks to go drive out to these remote areas and check on what was happening. And what was happening is that, they knew that in the area, as we work with this customer, they previously, before they were working with us, they couldn't access the best network. So again, the current provider that they had was choosing a network based on cost. So they're getting great cost, but that low cost didn't really benefit them because they weren't really able to connect. So even though they're paying a low price, they weren't able to take advantage of the service. And so we were able to work with them to basically get access to the right network in the area so that in the areas that they need to be in, they could access the best coverage. And part of a result of that is that was able to help reduce their support costs by about half because they could cut down on these truck rolls, they had reduced calls to their support center. So that's one thing that customer was seeing. Also, another challenge for this customer was that, similar to when a lot of people scale, they had started to split their devices. So when we started working with them, they started to have a second batch of devices they decided to use with another provider. And part of the challenge was with this other provider, as they started to use them, they couldn't get these devices connected again. And with the second provider, some of what was happening was they would try to troubleshoot and figure out what the problem was, but ultimately the provider just didn't have the technical capability and way to show them the end-to-end connection. And so we were able to work with them to say, hey, here's the flow of data starting from when you send it from the device to what's being received, to what's showing up in the servers and the network side. And we're able to show them that flow of information and help them pinpoint where it was that the communication was breaking down. And in doing that, the one, unfortunately the problem, they had a few tens of thousands of devices that had this problem. So not great, but the benefit was that, because we caught it at that stage and we were able to help them resolve the problem at that stage, it stopped this problem from growing. So they were able to fix their solution and grow their solution from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands. So when we look about scaling, that's one key thing is, even if you have problems, if you have problems today and you think you have a lot of devices, if you can overcome them, sometimes you can help you to grow even bigger, make sure you're hitting those next levels and next targets that you're trying to reach with your business and also with the products that you're trying to sell. So one takeaway from all this is that ultimately what we get from a provider in terms of coverage, paired with also things like support and also cost, those impact all the ability to scale, which is, can you get coverage in the space you need? Can they provide support to help you address some of those coverage issues or help you figure out why the coverage isn't working? And then also think about the cost. So now I've talked a little bit about coverage and some stories from our customers' experience. One thing I want to talk to you about is technology. And, earlier I touched upon this is that often when you're starting in one location, and this map kind of shows that the coverage and availability of a specific technology, for example, NB-IoT, is only going to be available in certain areas. Some countries on the map, but the ones in blue, have LTE and NB-IoT. Again, for those not familiar, these are cellular technologies built for IoT devices, not for phones, but specifically for IoT devices. And, some of it is, I had to learn this kind of a painful way is a couple years ago as I was starting my journey into buying IoT connectivity, I had a project that basically I needed to get NB-IoT global coverage. And so I said, hey, I need NB-IoT in all parts of the world because my product is going to go global and I need it available. And I must have called 7 to 10 vendors, and multiple ones would show me slides, they show me presentations, say, yeah, we have NB-IoT coverage, we can handle it, we've got that, no problem. But as it took a long time and kept probing, finally I found one seller that said, hey, NB-IoT is just not physically deployed, it's just not available in all parts of the world. So if I wanted to go into Asia, parts of Asia or even Africa, at the time, those just weren't available there. So that was something of a painful lesson that kind of made me realize that a lot of providers out there, some of them are just resellers. They won't have real understanding of what the technology is out there, number one. And number two, even when you need someone to be able to tell you and understand that, hey, well, this is what's available, and also this is what is capable of the underlying technology. So if you need NB-IoT or LTE-M, if you need it in this particular part of the world, you're gonna have to really think through that and make sure you get coverage and you can hit that if you plan to scale. On this map again, for example, if you had planned to expand into parts of Africa and you needed NB-IoT or LTE-M, then you're gonna have a challenge because there's currently not coverage there in the physical deployment of those networks. And just a brief touch, part of it is even with LTE-M and NB-IoT, sometimes the coverage, there's certain technical capabilities that each of those solutions and standards provide that for your IoT solution that may impact what you do and what you build. So now I've talked a little bit about coverage, I want to leave you with some questions that you can ask as you're trying to look at providers. And one of them you want to ask is, can you provide test results to show that there's coverage in the places that you need it? So can your provider actually, again, to return our point, do they have enough understanding of their coverage capability that they can go get that information for you? Another thing you want to ask for carriers is, how many providers, how many carriers do you have in each country where you expect to deploy devices? And also, do you control the PLMN? Now, for those that's not familiar with that term, that's Public LAN Mobile Network. And it's another way to kind of fancy way of saying, roaming list. Do you control the roaming list of which providers you can access? So similar to our customer in Africa that with the solar, we were able to control that list and help them figure out which one they needed. So that was a key capability for helping them. And also, if your devices are going to be mobile or moving around or operating in remote areas, can you select carriers on the fly to ensure coverage, is where they need it to be? Do you have the capability to modify the coverage and help me select the right carrier so I can make sure I have coverage if the one that you have set up maybe has the lowest cost or set up for a certain reason, but in another region, another carrier is better? Does your provider have the capability to do that and help folks work through that? So now that I've talked a little bit about coverage, I want to go into our second topic, second pillar of foundational pieces as we think about scaling and as we choose a provider, which is support. So as we think about support, monitoring, diagnostics, and these other capabilities are pretty critical as we scale. Again, when we get started, identifying issues is pretty simple. There's often a few devices and a few technologies and a few geographies. And often the amount of data that's coming in terms of logs and performance and operational data, it's pretty small and you can usually manage it. Maybe one person can do it with some simple tools, maybe a spreadsheet or maybe some simple dashboards. It's usually enough for one person to monitor and check. But as we think about scaling, typically then we need to start thinking about more advanced tools and expert help are going to be needed. When we talk about tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, often maybe the complexity and number of devices we have, hardware, network, and all that architectural components from a technology standpoint is going to change just because you typically are going to have to reach a broader geography, broader number of devices, and broader so on. And also the number of devices and data coming in can be kind of overwhelming just for one person to look at. And so, this is kind of matched the experience I've seen in the past when I was working with smart meter deployments. Often for a pilot, it's pretty small. Sometimes it was set up in a lab environment or set up in a really one small housing complex or small area. You could actually physically go see all those deployments, or I could physically see problems, or I could quickly log on and check and make sure the data was coming in and see if there's any issues. But when we think about scaling, that, when I knew the deployment would go to scale of any customer at scale, I knew that was not practical. I wasn't going to drive around, physically across a whole country or geographic area and be able to see all the devices. I had to have more advanced tools, and I had to be able to even begin to pinpoint problems, to flag and identify through all the information coming in to see where's our problem. And then as a second step, maybe I could work with a local utility or provider, and they would send someone in a truck to go check it, just because sometimes we're literally overseas or far away. So again, having advanced tools is a big benefit to me. And also being able to help people or have trusted help for the utility or end customer, that was a big key in terms of having support at scale and helping that grow out. So that kind of matches what we've seen at Aeris. So what we're showing here is a chart that basically says, we looked at Aeris, we looked at our support tickets, and we said, hey, where are the sources of problems coming from when our customers have issues with their connected deployments? And the three areas that we identified were typically devices, carrier networks, and also the cloud application. So all these components are interdependent, and it's often not really clear right away. And just a little bit more about the survey, we also attempted not just a raw number of support tickets, we attempted to weight the amount of impact that those issues were having. So just because one area had a lot of tickets open, if they all could be resolved in a minute or very quickly, then that didn't really have a big impact. But if there's a high number of tickets compared with each ticket taking a long time to resolve or taking a long amount of resources to look at, that usually signaled a more significant problem than, oh, just something wasn't powered on, or just reboot this, or that this was miswired or misplugged, or something more in depth that kind of was involved with that. And when we think about connected solutions for cellular and think about scaling, that's pretty common for what we see, that all these pieces have to work together, just like with any IoT solution. Again, from when I was trying to build and purchase cellular connectivity, I've had this experience before where, one time I was trying to build a solution and I was trying to get a product deployed, and in the development stage, working with the newer cellular technology, and effectively at one point the development was just stalled and we didn't know what to do. So finally I had to set up, I think I counted later, I think it ended up being a 6-way conference call between myself, the contractor writing the code and creating the hardware, the cellular modem module maker, the cellular modem chip manufacturer, the provider was selling me the data plan, and ultimately even the underlying carrier that was providing the cell tower connection. And literally we had to be on the phone call because I was the ultimate customer and kind of heading up the solution development. I had to say, okay, party number one, when we send data from your component, how do you send it to party number two? And I'd say, okay, well, that's good. Okay, you confirm that. Okay, party number two, when you get the data from party number one, what do you do with it? And can you confirm that it's going through correctly? Okay, yes, no, okay, great. And then so I really had to go down the line and ask all these folks on a 6-way conference call as I'm trying to navigate all these pieces and figure it out. And, in the end, kind of to short circuit to the moral conclusion, in the end, I had a very unsatisfying answer of someone just saying, well, it looks like there's a firmware problem, quote unquote. The general answer for, we don't really know, but something is not going right, but we can't pinpoint what it is. So it's a firmware problem. So, that was kind of challenging for me because it just really left me unsatisfied and really let me wanting to say, hey, I wish I had a partner or provider that could have stepped in and said, hey, how can someone, ideal world, someone has a magic wand, makes all those problems go away, but how can someone at least help me resolve some of those and more quickly get to a resolution of those? So that's when we think about support. That's one of the challenges we look at. And so one of the customers I want to talk about for Aeris that we've dealt with is, when you don't have the right support, that often can cause issues and even stall your business. So similar to like my project was stalled, this can also impact how you're going to deploy new features. And one customer that we worked with was a telematics provider in Europe. They were doing a tracking solution for their vehicles and for drivers. And one of the things that they wanted to do is they wanted to add video, because for those that are not familiar, that often fleet tracking, besides just monitoring where the vehicles are, a lot of them are looking to add, these providers, telematics providers, want to add video, because video has other things like, it's a safety element because the drivers can make sure there's an accident if anything happens. They can have video to say, hey, is the driver okay? We've detected some kind of collision event, or possibly danger. Or even for insurance purposes, because as we all know, someone says, well, your driver hit me and they were looking at their phone and they just plowed into me. And then, often the video can help back that up for insurance purposes and said, no, our driver was fully attentive, and the video is showing that actually you ran into the driver versus the other way around. So that's some benefit. And so part of that was with their video application, they were having problems getting the video uploaded through the cellular connection. And they've been trying to get this project going for 18 months. And as most of you know, 18 months in any technology field, that's a long time. And that basically starts to impact their ability to keep up with the competition and who are rolling out similar features. And part of it was when we started to work with this customer, they had been working with another provider, and the other provider basically just was trying their best, but ultimately just couldn't help them troubleshoot. either due to limited technical ability or for various other reasons, they just couldn't help them figure out to say, hey, what is going down and what's broken down here? And we were able to come in. And so some of it for us is that, we have the ability to see those kind of end-to-end communication. So literally we're able to sit with this customer, and within a short period of time, 1 to 2 weeks, we're able to say, okay, let's do a test. You start to initiate data from your hardware, start to initiate a video upload request, and we'll monitor on our end and say, hey, are we getting it? Is it coming through to our piece of the network? And because of that visibility, which I wish I had had when I was on that 6-way phone call, basically to say, hey, is there a way that you can see it, just make sure it goes through? So, fortunately for them, we're able to help them identify an issue. So in this case, again, short circuit to the end, again, we did identify, quote unquote, a firmware issue, but unlike my unsatisfying experience, we were able to help them figure out that, okay, it was a firmware issue. We're able to tell them what is the firmware issue. And so for their firmware, it looks like what had happened was that they had basically built their application, for an older 3G technology, which is a little slower. They'd added some more delays to account for the network slow speed and latency. And so basically those extra delays and timers that they were adding to kind of account for that slowness of the network was basically hampering their video upload. And so for those, a video is a high speed, high data, high throughput requirement in terms of that application. So that's what that video, on the LTE network, which is what they're using, their code wasn't really working for that or optimized for that. And that was part of what was causing those delays. And part of it is, having that end-to-end visibility was pretty key in us understanding, just like any kind of troubleshooting, that visibility is very key to say, here's how we can do it. Here's how we can see where the flow is, and here's how we can pinpoint and identify where the breakdown is in our communication and what's not working. Another customer I want to share with you guys is, so in terms of thinking about support, so we had another customer. So we talked about, besides just causing delays and development stalling it, even, your provider that you look for and work with as you scale can also impact your ability and in terms of your business, and also how quickly the provider can help you respond. So one customer we work with, a larger customer, basically had about 500,000 devices deployed. And one, random Tuesday, we noticed at around 10:30, the amount of data they were using started to increase very quickly. So you see here on the chart, this is the chart of the data consumed versus the time period. And basically the normal baseline is there. And like I said, around 10:30, they started to show this unexpected increase around 10:30. And what was happening was, basically starting to rack up millions of dollars in overages over the next, could have been millions of dollars of overages in the next couple of days, basically because there's something building up. So, part of it was we were able to help them, having a provider that can help you proactively monitor and also support you, besides just the end-to-end visibility, but is actually monitoring your behalf. So we were able to help work with them very quickly and say, hey, we've noticed this very large increase. Is this kind of expected on your side? And the customer is like, well, we're not really sure, like, not that we know of. So have we been hacked? Has some kind of security breach been going on? So fortunately, we were able to quickly dive in and jump and triage and respond quickly to their issue, and then first quickly identify through the data logs that, okay, no, it looks like all the devices and all the traffic from your devices is going to these specific, endpoints or specific destination that is trying to reach some kind of third-party site. It's not something that looks like from you guys. And we gave them the name of the location, and they looked it up and said, okay, well, it looks like it's something that we want our devices are supposed to connect to. So we don't think we've been hacked. People aren't trying to surf the web or download, BitTorrent files or, watch YouTube or Netflix or surf, social media on this. So it doesn't look like that's going on. But for some reason, all our devices have started connecting to this one endpoint. And so we're able to help them identify that. And so working with them again, they were able to kind of do a little more probing and figure out, what's changed, what's looked at. And what they were able to root cause and determine was the final root symptom of this was that, it turns out they had introduced an OTA update to their devices. And part of it is that as part of this update, they made a change in behavior to the devices where in order for the device to work, it had to retrieve some additional configuration information from this third-party site. Now, in an ideal world, that would have been fine, no problem, but for some reason, this third-party site was unavailable. So all these devices had now been changed, where in order to work, they had to contact this third-party site, get some additional information and configuration and get that, but that wasn't working. So that was part of it with this, what they were seeing is this huge basically spike is that all these devices in mass, these 500,000 devices, started to surge and send all this data retry after retry. They said, hey, I need my configuration information. Hey, I need my configuration information. None of it was coming back. So it just kept pounding, and this cascading effect and buildup. So basically all this data overages started to climb. So this is pretty business critical. We're talking millions of dollars in overages they're racking up very quickly. So fortunately, we were able to work with them and very quickly resolve it, identify and resolve the issue. So when we think about a provider, that's one key piece we want to think about is, can they resolve quickly and can they respond quickly, and are they even proactively monitoring and seeing what's going on? Because often we're all human. We have to go to sleep. We're not going to be watching, one person's not going to watch 24 hours, and even the best human eyes can't always miss things that are monitoring, monitoring and other companies and partners may help you with. So as we think about support, I want to go ahead and leave you with some more questions again. That these are things you want to ask your provider to help them figure out, is this something that they can provide for you and help you do? So some questions you want to ask your provider is, do you provide visibility to your deployment from the device to the cloud? Can you basically let people know and see, do you have end-to-end pieces and have that flow of data? That's often pretty key in any technology, especially when you're looking to scale and you want to troubleshoot problems. Another thing you want to ask is, can you quickly see if a problem exists? Can you help me identify if it's with my network, my device, or my application? Where is the problem? Can we narrow down the problem so I'm not searching all over the place for it? And lastly, in terms of troubleshooting device and network problems, what's your response time? What's your resolution time? Fortunately for us, we're, Aeris, we typically try to proactively monitor. We have network engineers that are watching it in addition to the alerts and configurations the customers will set up. We are actively monitoring and setting up. So we try to work our best to basically respond quickly to issues. And so that's something that when you work with any provider or technology, otherwise as you're scaling, it's like that's something that's pretty key to help you grow and scale. All right, so now I've talked a little bit about, I've done a little bit of talking, so I want to get some more feedback from you guys. So I want to ask our second poll question just to wake you up and mix it up a little bbit. So the question is, how would you rate the importance of support from a provider as you scale? So we should go ahead and see the solutions up there, the answers up there. So let's go ahead and we'll think through those. Feel free to think through what makes sense for you. I'll give you guys a few more seconds to lock in those answers for those that are thinking about things. Okay, I'll give you a few more seconds. Okay. Hopefully you're putting the final touches. You've made your final selection. No pressure, there's no prize, and there's no penalty. So nothing to do with this poll question. If you get it wrong, there's no right or wrong answer. So let's go ahead and close that poll and let's look at the results and see what you guys said. All right, okay, so it looks like most folks are seeing it as very important. So yeah, that makes sense. Obviously, I'm biased because that's my prerogative, but definitely in general support, pretty key piece of what we're looking at in terms of what we're thinking about in terms of customers and also how they're doing it. So thanks for their participation. Let's go ahead and close these poll results here, and then we'll continue on and move to a close here, move to our finish. So now we've talked a little bit about our support, coverage and support. So the last thing I want to talk a bit about is cost control. Now, when we think about scaling, cost control usually means data overages. That's, when I really thought about it, I'm like, well, cost is a lot of factors, a lot of pieces. I'm like, well, a big chunk of it, at least in terms of cellular connectivity and what you want to have from providers, how they help you control the data overages. So again, when we're thinking about, when we're starting, data overages are pretty small, or costs can be nominal in the terms of, not that it's not important, you definitely want to stop data overages when they're small or when you're at a smaller size, but usually the cost is not as killer. Sometimes you can absorb it, or the rate plans and data plans you're going to use, you're only using at a smaller level. And also things like SIM theft and unauthorized access, typically not as common, again, so you benefit from security by anonymity a little bit, just you're a small fish basically, so they're going to go after the bigger guy, not you. But when you think about scaling and growing, often we talked about, hey, we're all human, we need to sleep. And so what we used to be able to do manually, we have to start to be able to do automatically, and not, and that's how in terms of controlling costs. So in terms of data and rate plans, we need to make sure they actually size appropriately. We've kind of grown. Your deployment's like any small child that's grown. You have this pair of shoes that's too small. You got to make sure you get bigger and bigger feet. You got to have bigger shoes and right size. So that's in terms of data and rate plans. And also things like SIM theft and unauthorized access. Those are things we have to start to think about, because when you stop being the small fish and you become the big fish, then you have to start to protect yourself and think like, I am the big fish. How can I make sure I don't get, attacked, or kind of something happens to me and become a target of something that I don't want to happen to me? So, first thing I want to talk about when we talk about rate plans and usage levels is one area I want to think about is for manufacturing. Now, let's say you're making a connected device and product. When you get started off, typically, as you get bigger, maybe you want to look to deploy in the United States and in South America, and you look to manufacture overseas due to cost savings. Or maybe you're basically manufacturing in the US, but you also need to manufacture in another country to have two sources, two supply chains, just to hedge against any kind of geopolitical, any kind of trade wars, any kind of tariffs going on, or in the era of COVID, supply chains are being disrupted. Who knows what country's open today? Who knows what's open tomorrow? So these are challenges we have to look at. And typically when we think about supply chain and manufacturing, one thing about a lot of cellular devices that many of us are familiar with is typically with cellular devices, once you turn them on, the minute you turn them on, you start getting billed monthly. The monthly bill starts ticking and kind of running. And that can be okay, but some of the scenario is, we've had customers that they manufacture in another country and they want to be able to turn on and test their devices. So they want some data. Number one, can they have coverage that we talked about in that country that they need overseas that they're manufacturing? And number two, but the problem is for some of our customers, they would take their devices and they would put them away and put them in a warehouse. For example, what would happen is we had some medical device testing equipment that they would buy it and we're storing it in case if there were outbreaks of certain infectious diseases. But then the devices would sit in a warehouse waiting to be deployed. So they really couldn't afford to have it turn on that monthly bill. That really wasn't something they wanted. So they wanted the ability to, hey, how can I turn on my device, test in the country of manufacturer, and then basically move on from there, and then have the device wait until it actually gets deployed until I start that monthly bill. So you just want to make sure that in terms of rate plans in this scenario, in terms of global manufacturing, can your provider support that and handle that in terms of what you're looking to do? Another thing we want to mention too is SIM theft. So you're no longer the small fish, now you are the big fish. In terms of overages, you also want to make sure that you can make sure that the SIMs, if they're stolen, that you have ways to detect that. So at Aeris, we usually work with customers. Our network engineers are typically pretty proactively monitoring, and also in terms of also having automated alerts and ways to block and cut off service. But one of our customers, in terms of overages, we basically saw a customer that was typically deployed in Australia, and we asked them, we noticed that they were notified too through the alerts they had set up, but we also contacted them and said, hey, we noticed that you're having a lot of usage in Vietnam. Basically about 10,000 SMS messages are being sent. Is that something that you guys are expecting? And they kind of said, yeah, we saw that alert too, but we don't do any business in Vietnam and nothing should be there. And what was concluded is we were able to help them sort of trace and track that it looks like one of the SIMs had basically someone had cracked open the device or taken the SIM out of it, because when people see SIM, they think, oh, I'll just put it in my phone. And I found it in this box. I had a SIM card. I'm going to take it out and just use it for whatever I'd like. And they basically had gone and used it and started running up the SMS bill. And also similarly, we had another customer in South America, similar story, but for them, they started to notice a $9,000 bill in overages, and someone had taken their device that was meant to be deployed in South America and basically went ahead and started going all over the world and had international roaming and international data. So again, as we look to scale and grow, SIM theft and to be able to detect it and cut it off is something that's key and something we need to think about as well too. The last topic I want to talk about in terms of when we control for costs and overages is making sure that the authorized devices only connect to the authorized endpoints that we want them to. So one thing is, part of it is in terms of limiting the endpoints and where you can reach is, you want to make sure that from your device, it's not going to be used to connect to places that you don't want it to be. For example, the Google, the Facebooks, the Netflix of the world. Often also for the Internet of Things, often a denial of service attack is a common action that happens. So devices get taken over for whatever reason, and they're redirected to basically send traffic to servers that we don't want them to flood and overwhelm and commit that kind of attack. So often the challenge with that is then, if that were to occur, then you'd be stuck with the bill. But if you know the endpoints that your device is supposed to connect to, you can restrict it and say, I only want my device to connect to these authorized endpoints. Anything else should be blocked. So for whatever reason, if your device becomes compromised, you're at least not stuck with the bill of having to pay for the overages of someone using it for nefarious purposes or connect to locations that you want as well too, or don't want as well too. And lastly, another method to control is for non-dialable numbers. Typically with most cellular devices that have a SIM card in them, they're assigned a phone number or a number for identification purposes. But for IoT devices, those phones and numbers don't need to be reachable, because typically, sometimes that we've all gotten those spam calls or spam texts. Those would run up charges on your SIM if someone tried to call them. But also there's another security element too, is most hackers that we see, unlike the movies, hackers typically don't put on a hooded sweatshirt, go into the corner of the room, type on the keyboard and play a crazy music montage, and then 2 minutes later they've hacked the whole system. Most of them are engineers, they're pretty systematic. The first thing they do is often they'll scan what's available out there. They'll go ahead and maybe look and probing to see what are points that I can start to explore more to basically begin to see if I can do something more with it. And so dialable numbers is one way that they may just randomly start dialing numbers and say, hey, what's live? What's responding? So having a non-dialable number is a way to block and prevent your device from even showing up on that initial target list or prospect list for these hackers to say, hey, is that my device even visible, and even become a candidate for this kind of attack. So you can even block that without even knowing it, just by having that non-dialable number. So now that I've talked a little bit about cost control, I want to leave you again with some more questions that you can ask to your provider to say, hey, how can you help with these situations and scenarios? So do you have rate plans that can support your devices from manufacturing to global deployment and to end-to-end device in terms of that whole life cycle? And also, how do you prevent unauthorized senders from connecting to your devices, making sure your devices are only used for the purposes that you need? How do you guys do that? And also, what tools do you provide to detect and block overages? Do you guys have automated alerts? Do you have service blocking that can cut it off? Do you have a support team that helps monitoring? How are you guys doing that, and how can you guys help me with that? So with that, I've talked about the 3 pillars and the 3 pieces of the, what we look at from an IoT provider to help you scale. So I want to go ahead and ask one last final poll question, is just to get a sense of what you guys are thinking and how you guys have responded to the presentation. So when you think about scaling your IoT solution, which of the following is the biggest barrier? So that you should go ahead and see the options up there on the screen. So I'll give you guys a few seconds to respond to that, and then we'll go ahead and look at the results. So I'll go ahead and give you guys a few more seconds. This one's a little more reading involved, so hopefully you are awake and ready to click on the right answer. So again, no prize and no penalty, but just the benefit of knowledge and learning from your fellow audience members and seeing what they think. So let's go ahead and click on those final answers, and let's close the poll, and let's go ahead and look at the results. So, all right, interesting. So we've got a pretty good spread this time. So it looks like, controlling costs and supporting deployed devices. Great, okay, good. So interesting mix of folks. It changes every time in the audience. So that's good to hear and good to see. So let's go ahead and take those results off the screen, and let's go ahead and, so that goes ahead, and that concludes the material that I have prepared. So I'd like to turn it back over to our host, Max.
Well, thanks, Jason, for that excellent presentation. There was a lot of interesting stuff in there. For example, right at the end, I'd never even thought about having non-dialable numbers for IoT devices. And that makes a lot of sense, because security is just getting worse and worse and worse as a problem these days. So now we'll get started with today's Q&A session. And I want to thank the audience for their participation. We've got some great questions that have come in throughout the presentation, and we'll do our best to get through all of them in the time remaining. During the Q&A, I'll leave this screen with contact information for Jason on the off chance you'd like to get in touch with him following the webinar. Okay, Jason, let's get started. The first question, how can you tell if a provider can really support your deployment versus just reselling connectivity?
Yeah, so I touched upon it a little bit in the presentation, but again, like with any technology solution, you want to make sure they have a real depth of technical solution and ability. At Aeris, we've tried really hard to be that mix and blend of having the capability and technical capability, technical team, and bench strength of a larger provider, but also the agility of a kind of responsiveness of you get from a smaller provider. So we've really tried to make that blend. And some of it is just asking those technical questions of asking, what can you provide? How can you prove it? How can you help me resolve my solution? Because for better or for worse, anyone can throw together a sales and marketing plan, but can they actually deliver and provide that? So that's one real key area to look for and test your provider as you're out there looking for it.
It's like you say, everyone can throw together a marketing plan. It's like anyone can throw together a working prototype. But there's a world of difference going from one working prototype to a scaled up solution involving hundreds of thousands of devices.
Yep.
Okay, so what is something that people often overlook when growing an IoT cellular solution?
I think one key piece that I think about is really having that end-to-end visibility. The support piece I think is often under. I mean, I'm guilty of it too in all areas of my life, but I just underestimate the need for support. I think, oh, I'll just deal with it when I need it. I don't really need that. But an analogy I always draw is like where I'm at in California, we're dealing with a lot of fires, and thankfully there's some level of preparation for that. But who knows if they had just said, well, we'll just deal with it when it comes. It's too late when the emergency occurs and things start to break. You want to have those support and kind of other staffing ready to go before you need it. So that's a real key piece, I think, to have in place as you scale and build that out.
Yeah, I can see that. What are some of the differences in scaling deployments in different parts of the world?
So again, I think that's the challenge of the landscape is that as we look at international providers all over worlds, that's where you want to make sure you can really access those carriers that are all over, that are globally. And again, your provider can do that. We've tried our best at Aeris again to help people do that in terms of helping them, building those partnerships and building those agreements and building up the capabilities. So we say, hey, if you need to deploy in Africa or Asia or North America, South America, you name it, then we can access the right providers and make that coverage available to customers and help them really see where they can get help with that and make sure that that's really coming through for them. And I think that's something you want to look for your provider, make sure they can really assist in internationally and accessing those right carriers and multi-carrier networks.
To be honest with you, when it gets into this sort of thing, I find my mind is just bottled by I like little problems that I can wrap my brain around, and this stuff just is mind blowing to me. So what difference can a provider make when you're looking to scale up?
Yeah, so I think in terms of the provider, I think the key is some of the points I touched on that in terms of the support, but also coverage and just even being a trusted partner. I think that's really the key often because connectivity is going to be a key link in any kind of that end-to-end IoT solution. You want to make sure that provider can help you. One friend, colleague once said that you want to make sure, in areas you're weak, you want to make sure your partner can basically not run with you to the finish line, but sometimes they have to carry you across the finish line when you can't handle it. So you want to make sure that in the cellular connectivity space, rather than trying to do it yourself, you want to make sure your provider and partner can carry you in the areas that you may not be strong enough to make it.
I think that's really key, actually, not just have somebody who takes your money and runs for the hills, but somebody who's actually an active partner. Because again, you need all the help you can get these days. Which provider would work best in North America and Europe, including France? Sorry, I threw that bit in myself.
No, that's not a problem. Yeah, typically, the key is going to be you want to be able to assess. Part of it is your technology, what you're going to need to choose, whether you need specifically LTM or NB-IoT or specific technology. And also you want to make sure that your provider has coverage in those areas. So that's something, again, we've tried to work on in terms of making sure that we can help our customers with, and seeing that, hey, whether you're in North America or Europe, the provider that you have, it's really going to depend, and make sure that you ask the right questions. And we try to do with our customers, say, what do you need it to do? Is your device mobile? Is it going to be static? Do you need video? Do you need a low amount of data? What's your application? And helping us, so we sit down and try to understand that with customers, and then we can go and say, okay, great. So, you understand what you need from us, but we also pair it with our knowledge of all the providers we have in North America and Europe. We can actually provide coverage. So, like all great answers in the world, I would have to say it depends, but hopefully that frames up the problems that people, when they begin to approach it, knows how to ask, what does it depend on? And how can I make sure the provider I'm working with can help sort out and frame those questions so I can get the right solution that I need?
Yeah, I can imagine if you've got a provider who's not actually, if you've got a certain problem that the provider's not seen, and they're going to go, oh yeah, we can handle everything. And then you go, but we've got this strange case here, and having experience with lots of companies doing this sort of thing certainly helps to smooth the way. Scaling. If I want to scale, what are the pitfalls that I might, fall into?
Yeah, so some of the pitfalls, I think, in terms of often what works at a small level in terms of the performance or technical capability of your device, that's one area to look at, is making sure that you can handle the connections and even manage the connections at scale. So having one or two cellular devices or a handful, a couple hundred connect, maybe your backend systems or your connectivity solution can provide it. But then some things that you don't imagine, for example, we've had some customers that they built a few devices and they put them in the warehouse and that was fine, but then they went to a few 100,000 and was storing them, and then realized they had to do an update of them all, and they realized, wait, why are they not going through? And part of it was, well, you've got a couple 100,000 devices clustered and they're all around the same cell tower, and that's not going through. So some of that is we were able to help customers see that, but also just even that's a problem of scale that you don't think about, because when you're in a lab or in a small enough number, you think, oh, just push the update through, it works. But those are things that kind of can trip you up. So having a provider partner, we try to help our customers spot those ahead of time, and having any kind of partner and provider that helps do that can kind of help navigate those landscapes, specifically with that. Also the connectivity piece, but in terms of coverage piece, but that's probably a longer story. But that's all I'll say about that for now.
Okay, well, I think we've got time for one more question, because I've been charged with, and we know that everyone's got to get back to work or whatever they're doing, so I've been charged that we will end this at the top of the hour. So the last question, how should a buyer think about costs?
How should a buyer think about costs? So I think about costs as, again, the key is you have to be watch out. You sort of get what you pay for. So, I recognize we all have to be cost conscious, and we have to have, kind of keep the bottom line in mind. But there's a danger of always just jumping to the lowest price without really checking, can the provider really deliver what you're getting at that price? Like with all things in life, from the guy who does my plumbing to whatever, sometimes I've learned that often the cheapest guy is not always the right one, because there's a reason they're the cheapest. But sometimes I find the right guy that says, hey, they are cheap and they can deliver, and they've got the credentials and backing, and I believe their capability. So I think that's one real key, is when you look at costs, in terms of how much data do you need? How many devices you're going to deploy? Where do they need to go? What kind of, what's the boundaries of your performance that you're going to need? But if you don't know that, that's okay. Again, if we talked about, if you can find the right partner to work with to help you frame some of the questions and say, hey, you know what do you guys think about this? Or how do you guys handle this? To ask those questions, some of the ones I listed, but even also some of the ones that you have for your situation, to help idea, like, this is what I need to do, and to learn and educate yourself about that. So again, we work with customers all the time in that front. We try to help them as best we can to really help them build that solution, rather than just say, here's a price, here's a number, go, take it or leave it. We try to help customers really, build up that knowledge and frame up and understand what they need to do, so we can give them the right price, give them the best price we can offer, but also give them to make sure it's matching the right solution as well too.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jason. Those are great answers to some really good questions. For those of you who asked questions that weren't answered, we will be sending all of those unanswered questions to Jason and the team at Aeris so they can follow up with you after the webinar. As a reminder, this recording will be available for on-demand viewing tomorrow and can be found on IoT Central at iotcentral.io. And this brings today's webinar to a close. I'd like to thank our audience for their attendance and thoughtful questions, and a special thanks again to Aeris for their sponsorship, as well as to our speaker, Jason Chien, for his insight into today's topic. And once again, my name is Clive Maxfield, and I'm very pleased to have been your host for today's event. I look forward to seeing you all again on the next IoT Central webinar. Have a wonderful day.